Under the dim glow of a flickering streetlight, a man bent over the lip of an industrial dumpster, his hands disappearing into the shadows within. The air was damp, heavy with the stench of rot, the chill of metal biting against his skin. His fingers brushed against something soft wrapped hidden deep beneath refuse. Cold seeped through his gloves and a wave of nausea rose with the sour odor. To anyone passing, he was nothing more than another weary worker invisible in his stained uniform. Yet this man was Harlan West, a CEO who once signed contracts worth millions now faceless among the discarded and forgotten. He paused, his breath uneven, the weight of the moment pressing on him. What he held was not mere waste. It was a secret buried where no one would ever look. Something that once revealed would unravel everything he thought he knew. The warehouse swallowed sound, its vast space echoing only the steady scrape of worn soles across concrete. Silas Boone moved slowly, shoulders hunched each step, weighted by fatigue. His frame was thin, the outline of ribs pressing beneath fabric that had long lost its shape. Dark circles carved deep beneath his eyes told of nights stretched too far, mornings that came too soon. Around him, colleagues drifted past as if he were transparent, a shadow in plain sight. No greeting, no glance, just the rush of bodies eager to finish their hours. Boone lowered his head further as if the concrete itself demanded his gaze. His shoes dragged leather-cracked seams nearly split each scuff, a quiet reminder of persistence over pride. For those who might notice, he was simply another tired laborer. Yet his name carried a quiet gravity, Silas Boone. A man overlooked yet destined to be remembered. When the shift ended, Boone stepped into the night, carrying with him the silence of men who returned to nothing. His key rattled against a warped door hinges, crying out as it swung open. The light inside was dim, casting a weak yellow glow that revealed more shadows than warmth. Juniper sat waiting, small hands folded in her lap, eyes bright though her stomach betrayed her hunger. She lifted her head as he entered, her smile tentative yet eager. Against the peeling wall hung a photograph of May, the wife he had lost, her presence preserved in faded colors and a frame too large for the room. Boone set down a battered bag, his hand trembling, as though even this simple gesture might shatter the fragile balance of their lives. He lingered by the table, gaze shifting between the photograph and the child. Here lay the reason he endured. Back in the warehouse, authority walked on sharp heels. Trent Calloway moved through the rows with the certainty of one who believed the floor belonged to him. His voice, when it came, was flat, dry, cutting with precision that allowed no misinterpretation. This is Calloway's rule. You work by it, or you don't work at all. The sentence carried like iron across the air, silencing even the whisper of machines. Heads bowed as he passed, eyes fixed to the ground, no one daring to meet his gaze. His presence drew submission from every corner, as though the man himself drained resistance from those nearby. Boone stood among them, still and mute, neither protest nor plea escaping his lips. He endured the weight of Calloway's dominion, absorbing insult as though it were part of the labor itself. Here was power not earned by respect but by fear, sharpened into habit. Among the lines of weary men stood Bryce Harlow, his shirt-pressed crisp hair combed smooth as glass. He looked less like a laborer than a visitor pretending to belong. When Boone's hand slipped and a carton slid from his grasp to burst open across the floor, Bryce seized the moment. "Careful, old man," he drawled, voice carrying far enough for others to hear. "Don't strain yourself. We'd hate to lose you." He chuckled, leaning back as if amused by his own wit. The name he used, Tired Uncle, clung to Boone like a brand one meant to strip dignity from the bone. Boone said nothing, stooping to gather the scattered contents, his shoulders rounded in defeat. Bryce's grin widened, smug, and polished each smile a blade meant to cut. He embodied the quiet cruelty of those who rise not by labor but by scorn, feeding on weakness to mask their own emptiness. If Bryce mocked with polish, Dorian Keats stung with spite. His voice was high, almost sharp, words carried like pins meant to prick. He whispered as Boone passed, a stage whisper designed to be heard. "Watch him. He's always pocketing something." A false story, dropped like poison, spread easily in the warehouse air. Boone stiffened at the sound, his jaw tightening, though no reply came. Dorian's eyes gleamed with satisfaction, lips curling at the discomfort he created. He relished Boone's silence the way others began to glance sideways with doubt. It was not the blow of a fist, but the corrosion of rumor, more persistent and more cruel. Boone bore at his back straight, but his face drawn, each insult absorbed like another weight to carry. Behind Dorian's grin lay the seed of suspicion, small yet certain to grow, and Boone had no defense but endurance. The end of shift arrived, but Boone lingered in the shadows. He crouched by his locker, pulling close a frayed bag that had followed him through years of wear. Inside, something shifted with a muted rustle. He glanced around, his eyes darting to the corners, watching for figures that might emerge. His hands worked quickly, tucking the bundle deep within, fastening the zipper with deliberate care. A flicker of anxiety crossed his features, a look that betrayed more than fatigue. It was the look of a man guarding something fragile. To any casual glance, it was an ordinary act, a man packing his things for the long walk home. Yet the caution in his movements told another story. No one saw him then, or so he believed. The truth of that hidden bag remained his alone, suspended in secrecy, waiting to be uncovered at a cost far greater than he imagined. The night was heavy inside the rented room walls, stained by time air marked by the scent of damp plaster. Juniper slept curled beneath a thin blanket, her breathing soft, steady, untouched by the weight her father carried. Boone sat at the table, shoulders slumped, fingers wrapped around a framed photograph. May's face looked back at him, forever young, forever absent. His chest rose with a sigh that seemed to draw the last strength from him. The sound of wind pressed through the crooked window frame, whistling like a reminder of the cold world beyond. Boone lowered his head, resting his brow on the wood as though the grain could absorb his grief. In the corner, the old bag leaned against the wall, inconspicuous, yet present, the silent witness to every compromise he had made. Here alone, Boone's endurance shed its mask. What remained was solitude carved into silence, sorrow seated in his shadow. Morning came without mercy. Boone, weary from the night, had barely ended his shift when Trent Calloway's voice cut across the warehouse. "You'll stay. Another round. No pay." The words were delivered as fact, not suggestion, a decree more than a demand. Boone's lips parted as though to resist, then closed again, swallowed by fear or futility. He nodded once he'd lowered, resignation swallowing pride. Around him, colleagues exchanged glances, smirks curling at the edges of their mouths. They relished the spectacle of a man forced lower than themselves, safe in their own invisibility. Boone straightened slightly, as if preparing to endure what had been thrust upon him. Calloway had not needed force. The cruelty of power was sharper than any blow. Boone's silence was not agreement, but survival, and in that silence lived the sting of humiliation, the mark of labor ground down to obedience. Hours deepened, and Boone's body betrayed him. His back bent beneath the weight of crates stacked too high, sweat soaking the thin fabric clinging to his frame. Each step dragged his boots slick against the concrete. A stumble sent him to one knee, palms scraping rough against the floor. Still, he pushed upward, straining to rise, the effort wrenching from muscles already hollowed by hunger and fatigue. From across the space, unseen by Boone, another man watched. Harlan, masked in plain clothes, studied the figure bent beneath a burden that should have broken him. In that moment, something unsettled moved in the CEO's chest. But before compassion could grow, Dorian's voice pierced the silence with mockery. "Careful, Boone. Don't collapse before the job's done." The sneer rippled with laughter from those nearby. Boone lifted the crate again, wordless face, pale breath, ragged. Each motion told of a man who refused to fall, even as he was already falling within. The workers gathered around a battered table, the noise of machinery humming in the distance. Boone's voice, soft but steady, offered a small suggestion about how to ease the lifting of crates. For a moment, silence followed until Bryce cut across him with a sharp laugh. "Save your breath, Boone," he said, his tone carrying disdain, and the group joined in the laughter, eager to align with strength rather than sense. Calloway, seated with his arms crossed, gave the final word without looking up. "No one listens to the tired man." The sentence fell like a gavel, closing the space Boone had tried to open. His eyes lowered, a dimness settling there as if the last flame of hope had been extinguished. Across the room, Harlan's gaze hardened, studying the cruelty of the exchange. Boone's silence spoke louder than protest, marking him as invisible even among those who shared his toil. The break room filled with the smell of fried chicken and grease wrappers crinkling as workers tore into meals that gleamed with indulgence. Boone sat apart, his hands opening a small container of noodles, cold and clumped steam long vanished. He ate slowly, chewing with the patience of necessity, his solitude louder than conversation. Bryce, watching from across the room, smirked and flicked the greasy remains of a chicken bone toward Boone's feet. It landed with a dull slap grease, spreading like insult across the floor. Laughter bubbled among those nearby, the cruelty casual, unthinking. Boone did not raise his eyes. He only shifted the container closer, shielding it with his body as if it contained dignity rather than food. Harlan, seated not far, noticed the small meal, the rigid stillness in Boone's shoulders. His brows drew together in thought. The sight was a portrait of poverty endured without complaint, and it lingered. Whispers began in corners carried like smoke across the warehouse. Dorian leaned close to a knot of men, his tone sly. Boone pockets things when no one's looking. His eyes shone with the thrill of invention. Bryce leaned in, nodding, adding weight to the lie. He hides it well. Don't let the quiet fool you. Their words seeded doubt, quickly the kind that needed no proof to grow. A few workers exchanged glances, the suspicion already reshaping Boone's shadow in their minds. Boone, passing by, caught fragments of the talk. His shoulders sank, gaze falling to the ground, the burden of falsehood pressing on him like an added load. Harlan stood nearby, listening, a crease forming between his brows. The air thickened with something unseen, yet corrosive. Boone's silence gave the rumor room to spread, and in that silence suspicion began to root, promising darker days to come. The floor grew quiet as Trent Calloway's voice tore through the air. He pointed toward Boone, his words like iron. "You are a burden." The declaration echoed in the silence, heavy and final. Not one man lifted his eyes to protest. No one dared to stand beside the accused. Boone's lips pressed tight, teeth cutting into his lower lip until the skin whitened. His hand trembled by his side, betraying what his face would not. Across the line, Bryce and Dorian exchanged grins, cruel satisfaction gleaming in their eyes. Their laughter, low and sharp, fanned the flames of Boone's shame. Yet Boone remained still, absorbing the insult, shrinking further into the role forced upon him. From the shadows, Harlan observed, eyes narrowed, gaze sharpened like steel. This was no longer simple labor. It was degradation paraded before an audience. The moment branded Boone as less than the others, a man reduced to silence. The shift pressed on with the same unrelenting rhythm. Boone strained against the weight of a heavy crate, his back curved, sweat dripping down his temples. His boot slipped on the polished concrete and the load wrenched from his hands. With a crash, the crate slammed against the ground, the sound ringing through the cavernous space. Heads turned, workers startled, then amused. Calloway's response was swift, his fury unmasked. "Useless. You're not fit for this work," he shouted, words slicing deeper than any injury. Boone fell to one knee, chest heaving, palms scraped against the floor. His body trembled, sweat pooling, yet he pushed himself upward, a man refusing to collapse completely. Around him, sneers and whispers filled the air, judgment clinging heavier than the dust. To Calloway, he was no longer a worker, but a hazard, a liability to be despised. The warehouse had witnessed a fall, and it left no sympathy. Whispers reached Calloway's ear, whispers planted by eager tongues. Without hesitation, he stormed toward Boone's locker, the sound of the door wrenched open, reverberating like a verdict. Inside lay nothing more than the remnants of a modest life, worn clothes, folded neatly, a pair of shoes with frayed laces, an old photograph tucked into the corner. The emptiness of the space revealed no theft, no hidden stash. Yet Calloway's face twisted, anger burning brighter in the absence of proof. "Where is it?" he demanded, voice raw with suspicion. Boone stood silent. His eyes darkened, the weight of accusation pressing harder than any crate. Around them, workers hovered, murmurs swelling, some convinced guilt lay hidden, others simply unwilling to defend. Boone's silence was interpreted as guilt, though it was nothing more than endurance. The seed of doubt had been watered, and now it began to root, feeding on the emptiness of his locker. Harlan watched Boone with a sharper eye than before. The man moved through the warehouse with the same weary gait as everyone else, yet one detail stood apart. He never let go of the battered bag slung at his side. Even when bending to lift or stepping away for water, Boone's hand hovered near it, fingers brushing the worn strap like a talisman. Each time someone addressed him, his eyes flickered, a fleeting shadow of unease passing across his face. To others it was unremarkable, just another tired habit of a quiet man. But to Harlan it rang louder with each passing hour. He thought of the missing efficiency, the whispered doubts, the looks exchanged in corners. Boone seemed to carry more than a bag. He carried secrets. The cold of the warehouse wrapped around him, the vast machinery swallowing Boone's small figure until he looked less like a man than a question. And questions demand answers. The night air outside was pale beneath a reluctant moon. Boone emerged alone, shoulders hunched, clutching the small bag as though it held breath itself. He walked quickly, but his eyes darted from side to side, searching the shadows for witnesses. Reaching the dumpster, he hesitated only a moment before thrusting the bundle inside. The act was swift, desperate, the movement of someone who could not afford hesitation. His chest rose and fell as he drew in a deep breath, then turned his steps brisk, almost fleeing the scene. From the darkness, another presence lingered. Harlan stood at a distance, half-hidden eyes locked on Boone's retreating figure. What he had just seen tightened the knot of doubt inside him. The secrecy was no longer rumor but fact, an action carried out beneath the moon's quiet gaze. The bag was gone from Boone's hands, but the suspicion it birthed would not vanish. By morning, the rumor hardened into accusation. The tally sheets showed Gap's numbers that refused to match. Calloway seized the discovery with the hunger of a predator. His finger stabbed the air toward Boone. It's him. Always sneaking, always hiding. The declaration needed no evidence. His authority was evidence enough. Bryce stepped forward eagerly, his voice carrying false conviction. I saw him last night, skulking near the bins. Dorian nodded his agreement, sharp adding weight to the lie. Around them, the crowd tightened faces, turning toward Boone as though judgment had already been cast. Boone stood in the center, eyes lowered, lips pressed thin, the mark of a man stripped bare without trial. His silence only deepened their certainty, each second reinforcing the image of guilt. Harlan remained still, the knot in his chest twisting harder. Boone was no longer just tired, he was the accused, the scapegoat for every missing piece. The warehouse grew tense as Calloway stormed toward Boone's locker. He wrenched the door open, the clang ringing like a hammer against steel. Inside lay only the remnants of a stripped-down existence, shirts frayed at the cuffs, pants faded to a dull gray, a pair of boots with cracked soles. A few photographs slid loose corners, bent the images, faint but tender, Boone May and little Juniper smiling in a life that had slipped away. Calloway's hands dug deeper, tossing garments onto the floor, searching for proof that would not appear. The emptiness mocked him, but he would not be mocked. He turned his glare, venomous jaw tight with frustration. Around them, murmurs swelled suspicion, fed not by evidence, but by repetition. Boone stood silent, face drained of color, his figure stiff like stone, weathering a storm. Nothing was found, yet nothing was cleared. The silence left the crowd hanging, waiting for what would come next. The lack of evidence only sharpened Calloway's rage. He closed the distance to Boone in 2 strides, his shadow falling long. With one hand gripping Boone's shoulder, he leaned close, his voice low and burning. I will drag the truth out of you, he hissed, breath-hot eyes alight with fury. Boone's head bowed, lower, his knuckles whitening as his fist tightened at his side. Around them, workers froze, caught between fear and fascination. Some looked away, others smirked, feeding on the spectacle of power crushing the defenseless. Calloway's presence was suffocating, his authority pressed into Boone's silence like a brand seared into flesh. From across the room, Harlan's jaw stiffened, his chest taut with withheld reaction. The image was seared into him, a man bent low beneath cruelty, another man wielding power like a weapon. The tension lingered thick as smoke, promising no relief, only escalation. After the storm of threats, Boone remained unmoved. His lips never parted, no words offered in protest or defense. He breathed heavily, chest rising and falling, each exhale carrying weight. His eyes stayed fixed on the ground, refusing contact, refusing surrender to humiliation. Harlan, watching, saw not guilt, but endurance, a stubborn refusal to break even when all dignity had been stripped away. For a moment, something flickered in him, a spark of sympathy, faint but undeniable. Yet the image of the hidden bag gnawed at him, a thorn against compassion. Boone's silence could be read as strength or concealment, and Harlan could not decide which. The contradiction unsettled him, his heart shifting between suspicion and pity. Boone stood there as if carved from stone, still breathing, still enduring. And in that endurance lay a question: how much could one man carry before the truth, whatever it was, finally broke free? That evening, Boone returned home, carrying the worn bag with its guarded weight. He placed it on the table and unzipped it with deliberate care. Inside lay pieces of bread, edges hardened but still edible, and a carton of milk close to turning. He arranged them as though setting a feast, his hands trembling with a gentleness that betrayed exhaustion. Juniper stirred from her corner, her eyes lighting at the sight of food. She climbed into her chair, a smile stretching across her face. "Thank you, Daddy," she said, her voice soft but full of gratitude. Boone swallowed the words, catching in his throat. His eyes brimmed with unspoken sorrow as he watched her take the first bite, eating with the joy of a child unaware of sacrifice. In that room, the truth of his secrecy flickered, hidden not in crime, but in survival. For a moment, light touched the shadows, though the darkness lingered close. Boone's gaze lingered on Juniper until memory pulled him backward. May stood before him as if summoned, her presence vivid in the frame of recollection. Her smile was quiet but steady, a calm against the noise of hardship. In her hands she carried a tattered notebook, its cover bent, its pages lined with faint pencil marks. She pressed it into Boone's palms. "Keep this for Juniper," she had said. Eyes earnest, voice gentle yet unyielding. Boone remembered the warmth of that moment, the pride that swelled in him when her trust was placed in his hands. The vision dissolved, and he found himself again at the table, the same notebook resting inside the worn bag. He reached for it, his fingertips brushing the fragile paper, tracing the creases time had carved. In silence, he held on to the last tether to his wife, a vow folded into every page binding past and present together. The warehouse settled into darkness once more, and Boone slipped away with his bag. His steps carried him back to the dumpsters, the same path traced countless nights. This time, Harlan followed, shadowing each movement with quiet resolve. Boone paused at the edge, the bag clutched to his chest, hesitation flickering across his face. With a sharp breath, he lowered it into the bin, hands lingering for a fraction before pulling back. He turned, the weight of secrecy still etched into his posture. For an instant, his eyes caught movement, just a flicker, the shape of a man where no one should be. Boone's brow furrowed, suspicion flashing, but he pressed forward, quickening his pace. Harlan remained, hidden eyes fixed on the act he had finally witnessed. The sight confirmed suspicion, but offered no clarity. The bag was gone, but the truth inside it still lay buried, a secret suspended, waiting to be forced into light. The order came without warning, delivered in a voice cold and exact. "Full inventory. Now." Calloway's eyes, sharp as blades, settled on Boone as though the command were meant for him alone. The weight of suspicion pressed heavier than the crates stacked high across the floor. Boone trembled slightly but said nothing, bending to the task with quiet obedience. Around him, whispers leaked like gas. He'll slip up this time. He'll show his hand. The crowd of workers seemed to lean closer, hungry for a fall. Calloway watched from a distance, his posture rigid, his glare relentless. He was less a supervisor than a predator circling prey, waiting for the stumble that would justify his hunger. Harlan remained still, observing, his chest heavy with unease. The balance had tipped past fairness. This was no longer about work but spectacle, and Boone stood alone in its center. The moment had been set for collapse. The warehouse fell under a silence so heavy it seemed to muffle even the hum of machines. Boone's shirt clung to his back, soaked in sweat, his hands slick as they fumbled against the weight of boxes. His grip faltered. A crate nearly slid, steadied only by desperate force. His breathing grew ragged, each inhale loud in the quiet. Calloway's gaze followed his every move, eyes fixed with the stillness of a hunter watching for weakness. Workers stood around in hushed anticipation, their silence not support but a stage awaiting failure. Harlan's eyes flickered rapidly, scanning the man and the moment torn between revelation and restraint. Every second stretched, suspended as if the air itself refused to move. Boone's body strained under the pressure, his strength thinning, his dignity stretched to breaking. The scene was no longer work, it was judgment. And all present knew the collapse was near, even if none spoke the truth aloud. At last, the body gave where the will still resisted. Boone staggered mid-lift, his knees buckling beneath him. The crate slipped from his grasp, thudding onto the floor. He crumpled to one knee chest, heaving, face pale as chalk. Sweat rolled down in rivulets, dripping from his chin, soaking the collar of his shirt. Calloway's voice cut through the moment, a shout like a whip. "On your feet!" The command was barked not to help, but to break. Around them, no hand extended. No voice offered comfort. The others stood frozen, complicit in their silence. Boone pressed a palm to the floor, straining to rise, but his arms trembled violently. From the edge, Harlan moved a step forward, instinct pulling him closer, only to stop remembering the disguise he bore. His fists clenched at his sides, the conflict etched into his stance. Boone's collapse was no mere slip. It was the body declaring what the spirit refused to say, that he had been pushed too far. Laughter broke the silence as Boone struggled to rise from the floor. Dorian leaned close to Bryce, voice pitched just high enough to cut through the heavy air. "He'll slip soon. The secret won't stay hidden forever." Bryce's smile sharpened his reply, dripping with certainty. "It's only a matter of time." Their words coiled like smoke, curling toward Boone, who sat hunched, head bowed. His eyes closed tightly, not in denial, but in weary acceptance of their cruelty. He heard every syllable, the sneer embedded in their voices, yet he gave no answer. The isolation wrapped around him like chains, binding him in silence, even among the many. Harlan's jaw clenched, teeth grinding against the swell of anger. He tasted restraint like blood in his mouth, the need to act pressing against the need to remain hidden. Boone was surrounded not just by labor, but by scorn, and no ally dared step forward. Darkness stretched across the lot as Boone returned once more to the dumpsters. The moon was pale, its glow scattering shadows that stretched long against the ground. The bag clung to his chest as though fused to him, his hands trembling slightly as he held it. He paused at the edge, drew a deep breath, then lowered it into the pit of refuse. The act was deliberate, final, a ritual he had repeated too often. Boone turned quickly, his shoulders tight, his eyes scanning the stillness. He believed himself unseen. Yet not far away, a figure crouched in the dark. Harlan watched, eyes sharp, heart pounding with the weight of what he had witnessed. Suspicion hardened into certainty, though the truth inside the bag remained locked away. The scene sealed what had been building for weeks. Doubt no longer lingered, it demanded revelation. And revelation, Harlan knew, would not wait much longer. Alone, he stepped forward. Each footfall seemed heavier than the last, his heartbeat thundering as if the body itself resisted the truth. The dumpster loomed before him, silent, indifferent, a vessel of secrets. His hands shook as he gripped the rim, lowering himself into its cold shadow. The air was damp, clinging with the sour stench of decay. He reached down, his fingers brushing something slick fabric soaked and chilled. The bag. He gripped it slowly, the weight dragging upward as though reluctant to be found. Darkness pressed around him, narrowing the world to his breath, his hand the object rising from the depths. The moment stretched taut, every detail magnified. He had touched the hidden thing at last, yet its contents remained a mystery. Suspense hung like a blade in the air, waiting for the cut. Whatever lay inside would turn suspicion into revelation, and there was no turning back. The knot of fabric gave way beneath Harlan's trembling fingers. What spilled out was not contraband, not stolen property, but remnants of survival. A torn loaf of bread, its crust hard but still edible. A carton of milk, swollen near expiry sourness, clinging to its edge. And then, folded neatly despite its wear, a battered notebook with bent corners and faded lines. These were the treasures Boone had carried with such caution. No company goods, no evidence of theft, only scraps of food and the fragile vessel of a child's learning. Harlan froze, staring at the contents as if the world had tilted beneath him. The suspicion that had shadowed Boone for weeks dissolved in an instant, replaced by the raw sting of realization. This was no thief's cash. It was a father's burden hidden not from justice, but from shame. The truth lay bare, simple yet devastating, turning judgment into sorrow. The sight of the bread and milk carried Harlan backward into memory fragments he had observed but not understood. Boone setting the food on a table, Juniper's eyes widening, her small hands clutching at the meal as if it were a banquet. Her laughter rising soft but clear, her gratitude spilling in words. "Thank you, Daddy." Boone's eyes had glistened then, holding both relief and despair. Now, with the notebook pressed against Harlan's palm, the memory sharpened into clarity. Boone had not been hoarding for himself. He had been protecting his child from hunger, from want, from the world's neglect. The image struck Harlan with a force stronger than accusation. He saw not a laborer hiding guilt, but a father preserving dignity. His chest tightened, throat thick with emotion he could not suppress. For the first time, Harlan's suspicion crumbled, and in its place grew the ache of recognition and sorrow. The weight of the bag in his hands dragged Harlan into reflection. He thought of Calloway's voice, cruel and unyielding branding, Boone a burden before all eyes. He remembered the sneers of Bryce and Dorian, the laughter that had followed each stumble. Against these memories stood the simple act of Boone, carrying scraps and notebooks with a devotion far greater than his strength. The contrast burned in Harlan's chest, a fire fueled by shame and anger. His fingers tightened around the bag knuckles, whitening as if clutching proof not of crime, but of injustice. His lips moved, words slipping out in a whisper meant only for himself. He didn't steal. He saved. The truth was now undeniable. Within him, resolve gathered like a storm. He had witnessed enough degradation, enough cruelty masquerading as order. The time for silence had passed. Confrontation was no longer choice but necessity, waiting only for his step forward. Harlan stood in the warehouse, the bag heavy in his grip, its contents heavier still on his conscience. Around him, men moved restlessly, waiting for Calloway's next command. Their faces were marked by fear, by obedience, by the dull endurance of those long resigned. Harlan's gaze swept across them, and in their silence he saw Boone alone, diminished yet still standing. Then came the memory of Juniper's bright eyes, the way they glowed at the sight of bread, the sound of her voice filled with trust. That vision tipped the balance. He straightened his back shoulders, squared the posture of a man who had carried power in boardrooms but now carried truth. His chin lifted, the decision sealed. The disguise no longer mattered. The injustice could not remain hidden. With measured steps, Harlan moved toward Calloway, the crowd parting unknowingly as though sensing a shift. A leader was about to appear. The warehouse stilled when his voice rose deep and resonant, cutting through the tension like a blade. "I am not a new worker," he said. "I am Harlan West." The name landed with the force of revelation. Silence fell sharp as if the air itself recoiled. Calloway's face froze, color-draining eyes wide with disbelief. The iron certainty he wielded moments ago shattered under recognition. Boone lifted his head, confusion sparking into shock, his mouth parting without sound. The men who had whispered and laughed now stood motionless, unsure whether to bow or flee. Authority had shifted in an instant, pulled from Calloway's grip and placed firmly in Harlan's. The truth of his identity stripped away the false order that had reigned. Every eye fixed on him, every breath held in suspense. The mask had been cast aside, and the man beneath it was nothing less than judgment embodied. Harlan's gaze locked on Calloway, the weight of silence pressing against the room. He stepped closer, voice steady, words deliberate. "The law here does not belong to Calloway. The law is justice." The statement rang clear, undeniable, and final. Calloway's mouth opened, but no words emerged. His confidence shrank as swiftly as his posture. His eyes dropped, shoulders stiff, unable to meet the stare that bore into him. Around them, the workers were statues, not a sound breaking the air. Boone trembled where he stood, eyes glistening, his hands curling at his sides as though the strength to stand was finally overwhelming. In that moment, the spell of fear Calloway had cast was broken. Power had shifted, stripped from cruelty and restored to fairness. The humiliation Boone had borne now mirrored on Calloway's face, his silence louder than denial. For the first time, justice stood in the room, alive and unyielding. The bag lay open on the table, its contents plain for all to see: stale bread milk, nearly spoiled, and a battered notebook. Harlan spoke, voice firm, telling the truth that had been buried under suspicion. Boone had stolen nothing, he had only gathered what little he could for his daughter. The room fell silent, every whisper choked away. Bryce and Dorian shifted uneasily, their eyes darting anywhere but toward Boone. Calloway stood rigid, unable to answer. Boone's face crumpled, tears slipping down his cheeks as if the weight of weeks had broken free. Harlan placed a steady hand on his shoulder, anchoring him in the storm. For the first time, Boone was seen not as a burden, but as a father, his dignity restored before those who had denied it. The truth had arrived sharp and undeniable, and no one dared challenge it. When silence settled, Harlan's words carried across the room with finality. Boone would receive higher wages, his labor recognized at last. Juniper, the daughter for whom he had endured so much, would be given a scholarship, a chance to escape the cycle that bound her father. The workplace itself would be reshaped, its rules rewritten in fairness, its shadows cleared. Calloway would face investigation and retraining, stripped of his unchecked authority. Around them, the workers broke into applause, hesitant at first, then rising with forced relief spilling into the sound. Boone stood still, tears drying on his cheeks, overwhelmed not by pity, but by justice made real. For once, cruelty had been overturned, and fairness had found a voice. The moment did not erase the pain, but it carved hope where despair had lived. Justice had been done, and everyone knew it. In the dim room, Boone gathered Juniper into his arms. She laughed, her small voice filling the space as if it could chase away every shadow. Harlan stood at a distance, watching, his thoughts heavy yet clear. In a dumpster, we expect to find waste, but sometimes we find dignity. The words lingered like a quiet oath. Then came the final call. Will you stay silent? Or will you speak? The story closed not with despair, but with the question of choice. And to those who had listened until the end, a sincere gratitude remained: thank you.